August 12, 1944. The blistering sun beat down on the barbed wire fences of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Dust swirled in the dry heat as hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war marched back from their morning work detail. Their boots scuffed against the gravel, their uniforms sweat-stained and torn, their expressions stoic. They had been captured thousands of miles away, some in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, others pulled from the flaming wreckage of ships struck down in the Central Pacific. For them, America was an enemy without a face, a colossus that rained fire from the skies and buried them in steel. They expected cruelty. They expected silence. What they did not expect was the sound of their names being called, followed by the delivery of letters. A guard stood in front of the assembled men, a stack of envelopes clutched in his hands. One by one, names were read aloud. Hesitant figures stepped forward. Inside the envelopes, written in careful English and sometimes translated by camp officials, were messages from American families, mothers, church groups, schoolchildren, words of compassion addressed to the very men who months before had been sworn enemies. "We pray for your health," one note read. Another, "You are far from home, but you are not forgotten." The prisoners stared at the pages, some trembling, others refusing to touch the letters at first, as if they were a trick. And then slowly confusion gave way to something more powerful: disbelief. Camp McCoy POW Administrative Log, Aug. 1944. The Japanese captives had been raised on imperial propaganda. In Tokyo, newspapers described the United States as a land of monsters, a barbaric nation where prisoners would be starved, humiliated, or executed. Soldiers were told that capture was a fate worse than death. For many, surrender had been unthinkable. Yet here in the heartland of their enemy's territory, they were being treated according to international law, given food, shelter, and even letters of kindness. "This cannot be real," one prisoner muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he stared at the flowing English script. Dramatized composite. This strange ritual of letter reading was not confined to Camp McCoy. Across America, at Fort Custer in Michigan, Camp Kennedy in Texas, and dozens of other sites, over 50,000 Japanese prisoners of war found themselves recipients of an unlikely experiment in psychological warfare and humanitarian outreach. Letters came from Methodist congregations, from the Red Cross, and from small-town schools. Children sent drawings. Housewives enclosed pressed flowers. Some messages even included photographs of families smiling beside white picket fences. To the Japanese mind, steeped in the Bushido Code and tales of American brutality, these letters were impossible to reconcile. Red Cross Liaison Report, Dec. 1944. To understand the shock of these moments, one must step back to 1942, when capture was still a stain upon a soldier's honor. On Bataan, thousands of American and Filipino troops had suffered under the merciless hands of Japanese guards. The infamous Death March confirmed Allied fears of a merciless foe. In turn, Japanese troops expected nothing less from their captors. The Imperial Rescript of 1937 had declared that surrender was cowardice. To live as a prisoner was to bring shame to one's family. "We were told we would be slaughtered if taken alive," recalled a Japanese sailor after the war. U.S. Navy Interrogation Report, 1945. Yet in the fields of Arkansas and the forests of Minnesota, reality contradicted propaganda. Prisoners were not slaughtered. They were fed beans and bread, given work assignments, and sometimes handed envelopes filled with words of empathy. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, binding it to treat captured enemies with dignity. But the act of writing letters went beyond obligation. It was part policy, part culture, part experiment. American officials recognized that morale among prisoners mattered. If treated humanely, Japanese POWs could be sources of intelligence, potential tools for propaganda, or at the very least, examples to show the world of America's moral high ground. But the letters also reflected something more intimate, the impulse of ordinary Americans, many of whom had sons overseas, to see the enemy not only as combatants, but as fellow human beings enduring the miseries of war. War Department Memorandum, June 1943. Still, the sight of letters in enemy hands created tensions. Guards who had fought at Tarawa or knew men lost at Pearl Harbor sometimes bristled at the idea of extending kindness to those who might once have killed their comrades. "Why should my neighbor's boy die in France while we send flowers to Japs in Wisconsin?" wrote one disgruntled citizen in a letter to the editor of a Chicago paper, Chicago Tribune of 1944. Yet despite dissent, the program continued. War Department officials argued that the treatment of POWs was a weapon in itself, one that could break the enemy's will while strengthening America's reputation abroad. Some secretly treasured them, hiding the envelopes beneath their straw mattresses, rereading them under dim barracks lights long after curfew. The words carried by those letters became seeds of doubt in the propaganda Tokyo had drilled into them. Could an enemy capable of such mercy truly be the monster their emperor described? Post-war POW testimony, 1947. The hidden advantage of this program lay not in sentiment alone, but in the machinery of policy, technology, and organization that made it possible. America had perfected an information weapon disguised as compassion. Under the oversight of the Provost Marshal General's office, the War Department worked with the American Red Cross and local organizations to distribute and translate thousands of messages. Prisoners, whether illiterate in English or deeply suspicious, were offered translations from bilingual staff, and Japanese-American Nisei interpreters recruited from camps like Fort Snelling. War Department Circular 106, 1943. The very act of translation was a strategic gesture. Words filtered into Japanese idioms that resonated with soldiers raised on Confucian ideals of family and obligation. Technically, the logistics were staggering. By 1944, nearly 426,000 enemy prisoners of war lived on U.S. soil, most of them Germans, but among them tens of thousands of Japanese. Every camp required mailrooms, censors, translators, and distribution officers. The letters were inspected, stamped, and catalogued. Names were called out like roll call, and the messages were handed out in ceremonies carefully observed by guards. What looked like a simple ritual was, in fact, a bureaucratic triumph of paperwork, transport, and human resources. Office of the Provost Marshal General Report, 1945. The Japanese captives felt the weight of these letters most acutely after a single defining moment, the summer of 1945 at Camp Kennedy, Texas. It was here, under blistering heat, that a shipment of over 300 letters arrived at once, many of them from women's church groups in the Midwest. The letters spoke of harvests, of praying for peace, of sons far away in France and the Pacific. They addressed the prisoners not as enemies, but as men who must long for home. The impact was immediate. According to camp officers, arguments broke out among prisoners. Some believed the letters were psychological poison, meant to weaken their loyalty to Japan. Others, younger conscripts torn from farms in Kyushu and Hokkaido, openly wept as they read the words. "I never thought Americans had mothers," one prisoner reportedly whispered. Camp Kennedy Guard Diary, July 1945. Enemy disbelief hardened in some quarters. Imperial officers within the camps, diehards who still saluted the rising sun each morning, warned their men not to be deceived. "It is a trap. They seek to break your spirit," they insisted. Dramatized composite. Yet American officials knew that the fractures were forming. For intelligence officers, the letters were a wedge. Interrogators noted that prisoners who had received messages often became more cooperative in questioning, sometimes volunteering details about unit organization or supply shortages. For others, the shift was subtler. Their eyes softened, their voices trembled when they spoke of home. U.S. Army Interrogation Notes, AUG 1945. Technically, this was a campaign of both hearts and logistics. Engineers of communication, clerks, translators, printers, played as vital a role as the men who built tanks and planes. Each envelope had to travel through postal networks, census desks, and into the camps themselves. Teletypes clattered in offices. Trucks rumbled along back roads hauling sacks of mail. In a war defined by weapons of steel and fire, here was a different kind of arsenal: ink, paper, and human empathy. U.S. Army Postal Service Report, 1944. The most dramatic confrontation over the letters came in August 1945, just days after Japan's surrender. At Camp McCoy, tensions boiled over when a group of die-hard officers attempted to destroy a batch of incoming mail, convinced it was American propaganda timed to coincide with their homeland's humiliation. Younger enlisted men resisted. Guards intervened, A scuffle broke out in the dusty yard beneath the camp's watchtowers. When order was restored, something remarkable had happened. The enlisted prisoners had refused their officer's command, choosing to keep their letters. In the quiet that followed, one soldier clutched a note from an Iowa farm wife to his chest, whispering, "She has sons too." Camp McCoy Guard Statement, Aug. 1945. What made these moments so powerful was not just the kindness of strangers, but the precision of America's administrative machine. Every letter was a weapon of paradox. Compassion that destabilized loyalty, empathy that corroded propaganda. In the words of a post-war analyst, the enemy was conquered not only by firepower, but by paper and patience. U.S. Strategic Psychological Warfare Survey, 1946. And yet the deepest significance of the letters was still unfolding, because behind each simple page was a story not only of the prisoner who received it, but of the American family who sent it. A mother grieving for her son in France but still writing to a Japanese boy in Texas. A farmer's child who drew a picture of a house and dog, never knowing it might bring tears to an enemy soldier's eyes. These unlikely exchanges would echo long after the last guard towers were dismantled and the last barbed wire fences torn down. For the Japanese prisoners, the letters were not only unexpected kindness, they were seeds of doubt that would grow into something larger. When they returned home to a defeated Japan, many carried the memory of those messages with them, struggling to reconcile their nation's stories of American brutality with the strange compassion they had experienced firsthand. Some would speak of it. Others would remain silent, too ashamed to admit they had felt gratitude toward their enemy. But the letters lived on, preserved in diaries, hidden in drawers, reminders of a war fought not only with rifles and bombs, but with words. And so the question remained, what was the ultimate impact of these letters on the war itself? On morale, on the psychology of defeat, and on the legacy of how enemies could become human once more? The answer would stretch far beyond the fences of those camps, and shape the post-war world in ways no bullet ever could. The war was over, but the echoes of those letters had only begun to reverberate. In September 1945, as the last prisoners at Camp Kennedy prepared for transport back to Japan, an officer from the U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division noted that many men clutched envelopes in their hands, rather than rations or souvenirs. For them, those pages had become talismans, reminders that the enemy they had been taught to despise had shown them a face of humanity. Psychological Warfare Division Debrief, Sept. 1945. Strategically, the effect of these letters was subtle but profound. The humane treatment of prisoners became a powerful propaganda tool for the United States. Reports filtered back to Japan through repatriated POWs, undermining years of imperial indoctrination. In 1946, during interrogations in Tokyo, several former soldiers admitted that hearing about kindness in American camps had shaken their belief in the emperor's divine cause. "We were told Americans were demons," one recalled, "but in the camps they fed us. Some received prayers from their families. It was like another world." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division, 1946. The psychological effect stretched into intelligence as well. Officers within the office of the Provost Marshal General reported that Japanese prisoners exposed to letters often proved more willing to cooperate with interrogators. Some revealed logistical details, others described training methods, and a few even provided sketches of coastal defenses. Compassion, paradoxically, had become an instrument of war. Provost Marshal General's Office Debrief, Feb. 1946. But the impact was not one-sided. For American families, sending letters to Japanese prisoners was an act of moral assertion. Many who participated were women, mothers with sons in combat, sisters writing from towns draped in Gold Star banners. Their words affirmed a belief that the United States fought not for conquest but for a higher principle, that even enemies deserved dignity. Historian accounts suggest that church groups and civic organizations saw it as both a Christian duty and a patriotic gesture. American Red Cross Bulletin, 1945. By reaching across the lines of battle, they were also reassuring themselves that their own loved ones, if captured, might receive mercy in turn. There was a cost, too. The choice to treat prisoners humanely and to extend kindness in the form of letters sparked resentment among some Americans who had lost family members at Pearl Harbor or in the jungles of the Philippines. Editorials in newspapers like the Chicago Tribune and San Antonio Light condemned the practice, calling it misplaced charity. Yet War Department officials stood firm, citing both the Geneva Convention and America's long-term moral interests. War Department Correspondence, 1944. In retrospect, their gamble paid off. The letters became a quiet but enduring testament to the values the Allies claimed to uphold. Technicians, clerks, translators, and postal workers rarely appear in battlefield histories, yet here they were, soldiers of a different kind. Each typed translation, each censored stamp, each delivery through camp gates reinforced America's invisible arsenal of empathy. The engineers of this system, linguists trained at Fort Snelling, Postal Service veterans rerouted into military mail divisions, Red Cross coordinators who catalogued donations, were the unsung sustainers of this effort. Without them, the words of thousands of families would never have reached enemy hands. U.S. Army Postal Service Annual Report, 1945. For the prisoners themselves, the legacy was complicated. Some left their letters behind when they boarded repatriation ships, fearing shame if their families discovered they had accepted gifts from the enemy. Others smuggled them home, preserving them in notebooks and trunks that would remain hidden for decades. Few even corresponded with American families after the war, tentative exchanges that blossomed into friendships. In the ruins of post-war Tokyo, those letters became windows into another world, a world that had seemed unimaginable during the height of the Pacific War. The long-term effects stretched into doctrine. During the Korean War, U.S. psychological operations officers cited the World War II letter campaigns as precedent, arguing that compassion could be wielded strategically alongside firepower. In Vietnam, similar efforts were made to broadcast humane treatment of prisoners, though with more uneven results. And in the modern era, military theorists point to these experiments as part of the foundation of hearts and minds strategies, where the battle for perception becomes as decisive as the battle for terrain. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Handbook, 1965. For Japan, the memory of humane captivity influenced its own transformation. Many repatriated POWs carried home stories of American kindness that challenged the militarist narratives of the 1930s. Post-war educators and reformers cited these testimonies when shaping new civic values in schools. If even our enemies could see us as human, one Japanese teacher wrote in 1947, then perhaps we must learn to see ourselves as part of a world beyond the empire. Japanese Educational Reform Journal, 1947. And yet, beneath the layers of strategy and policy, the most enduring legacy was human. One former POW, interviewed in 1980, revealed that he still kept a faded letter in his desk drawer. The note, written in neat script by a Midwestern farm girl in 1944, had told him that she prayed for his safe return to his family. "When my country was burning," he said, "this letter reminded me that not all hearts were hardened by war." Oral History Collection, Kyoto University, 1980. The letters stand today as artifacts of paradox, weapons of war crafted from paper, ink, and empathy. They remind us that in an age of firebombing raids, submarine warfare, and atomic destruction, there was still space for a gesture of humanity. The barbed wire of the camps may have divided victor from captive, but the words carried across that divide broke chains more subtly than any liberation by force. And so, the lesson endures. In the calculus of modern war, power is not measured solely in tanks, aircraft, or ships. It is also measured in the resilience of values, in the ability to extend humanity even when surrounded by hate. For every bullet fired, a letter was written. For every prison fence erected, a message slipped across. In the silence of history's pages, those letters still whisper. Connection can outlast destruction, and empathy can pierce even the strongest walls of propaganda. As one American mother wrote to an anonymous Japanese soldier in 1944, "The war will end, but you are a son as my son is a son. May you both find peace again." Letter Archive, Wisconsin Historical Society, 1944. Her words close the story with a lesson universal. In modern war, compassion itself becomes a strategy, and in the ashes of conflict, it is often the smallest human gestures that endure the longest.